30 days after Marcus offered me $500,000 to leave my husband and marry him, he sat across the same table and asked me to make it all go away. The same table. That long walnut one in his father's dining room, the one that seated 14 and had never once seated me at its head. Same chair. Same man in the same kind of pressed shirt, except the collar sat a little tight now because he'd been sweating and hadn't noticed. The difference was his hands. 30 days earlier they'd been still. Now they wouldn't stop moving. I did not raise my voice. I want that clear from the start, because it matters. I never raised my voice once in any of this. I slid a folder across the walnut, the same distance he had once slid an envelope toward me, and I watched him look at it the way people look at a bill they can't pay. Undo it, he said. Whatever you did. Name it. Everything has a price. I let that sit. For seconds, maybe 5. I audit things for a living. I find what people bury in the footnotes, the small clause on page 11 that quietly undoes the promise on page 1. What I'd learned in 30 days was that Marcus had signed his name to a great many things without reading them. Every one of those signatures was now working for me and against him. That was the whole of it. He built the trap. He priced it. He signed it. All I did was reconcile the numbers he wouldn't check. He didn't understand yet how finished it was. He would. But I need to take you back first, because none of this makes sense until you see how it started. 30 days earlier. A different night, a different envelope, a man who genuinely believed that $500,000 was enough to move me. If you're new here, this channel is about a particular kind of person. The kind who gets underestimated. The kind whose quiet gets read as weakness, whose patience gets read as permission to take a little more. I've noticed that the people who shout are almost always the ones losing. Shouting is what you do when you've run out of proof. It's the sound of trying to win by volume because you can't win on the facts. I don't shout. The person with the receipts doesn't need to, so these stories aren't really about revenge. Revenge is loud and messy, and it usually costs you more than it costs them. What I'm talking about is quieter. It's the slow work of letting people show you who they are, writing it down, and waiting for the day the numbers reconcile on their own. The day the ledger balances and there's nothing left to argue with. I'm going to tell you all of it. Every receipt. The exact document, the exact figure, the exact moment it closed on him, and he understood he'd signed his own name to the end of it. Nothing held back. But to understand how a folder ended someone, you have to know who is holding it. So let me tell you who I am. My name is Elena, and I find things people hope no one will look for. I'm a forensic accountant. When a company is about to be bought, someone pays me to open its books and read them the way most people never bother to, all the way to the back, past the confident summary on page 1, down into the footnotes where the truth usually hides. A business can look immaculate from across the room. Clean revenue, smiling projections, a founder who shakes your hand firmly. Then you get into the footnotes, and there's the loan nobody disclosed, the liability parked off to the side, the signature on a guarantee no one wanted to explain. My whole career rests on one fact: the numbers reconcile eventually. People lie. Ledgers don't. Here's the important thing about how I'm built. When I find a discrepancy, a figure that doesn't match, a story that doesn't add up, I don't get angry at it. Getting angry at a discrepancy is like getting angry at the weather. It's pointless, and it fogs up your reading. So I document it. The date, the amount, who signed it, and then I keep going. I've watched grown men in expensive suits come apart in a conference room while I sat there writing things down. Calm isn't the absence of feeling. It's what you do with the feeling so it doesn't spend itself before it's useful. I married Daniel 11 years ago. Daniel isn't a rich man, though he was born into a rich family, which is a different and more complicated thing. He teaches high school history. He's patient in a way I'm not naturally, warm in a way I had to learn. He married me for reasons that had nothing to do with money, and I loved him for the same. We had a good life. A small house with a mortgage we actually paid attention to. Nothing about it needed to be more than it was. His family felt otherwise. The Harmons had money, the kind that arrives before you're born and never has to be earned again. A holding company the grandfather built, real estate mostly, passed down and grown and guarded. To them, Daniel had made 2 disappointing choices in life: teaching instead of joining the family firm, and marrying a woman who counted other people's money for a living instead of simply having her own. At every dinner, I was introduced by my job, never my name. Daniel's wife, the accountant. Said the way you'd note that someone was in trade. I filed all of it. Not out of bitterness, and I want to be precise about that. I just noticed, the way I always notice, and set each small slight aside where I could find it again if I ever needed it. For years, I never needed it. Then, at a Sunday dinner in early autumn, I caught Daniel's older brother Marcus watching me from across that long walnut table. Not the way family looks at family. The way a buyer looks at something he's decided he's going to own. He waited until Daniel left the room. It was 2 weeks after that first dinner. Marcus invited me to the house on a Thursday afternoon under the excuse of family paperwork, some question about a policy he said needed a second set of eyes. Daniel was there when I arrived. Then Marcus sent him to the far end of the property to look at something with their father, and it was just the two of us at the walnut table, and I understood that the paperwork had been exactly that. An excuse. He didn't rush it. I'll give him that. He poured 2 glasses of wine I hadn't asked for, sat down across from me, and talked for a while about nothing. The market. The house. The weather. Then he set his glass down and looked at me with an expression he'd clearly practiced in a mirror. Warm and a little regretful. The look of a man about to do a favor you hadn't asked for. I'm going to say something you're not going to want to hear, he said. And I want you to really listen before you react. I told him I was listening. My hands were flat on the table. Steady. He said Daniel was a mistake. That was the word. A mistake. A good man, he allowed, but a small one, a man content to teach children about dead presidents in a rented classroom while the world moved past him. He said I was wasted there. That he'd watched me across enough dinners to see what his brother couldn't, that I was sharp and capable and belonged with someone who could actually provide. Someone at my level. He meant himself. He wanted me to know he meant himself. Then he reached into the jacket folded over the chair beside him and took out an envelope, thick and cream-colored, and slid it across the walnut until it stopped precisely in front of me. $500,000, he said. You divorced Daniel. A clean, quiet divorce, nothing that embarrasses the family. And in a year, when it's respectable, you marry me. The 500 is yours the day the divorce is final. It's not a bribe. Think of it as a signing bonus. I looked at the envelope. I didn't touch it. I want to tell you what I felt, because it wasn't what you'd think. Not rage. Rage is hot and fast, and it makes you say things you can't take back. What I felt was a cold clarity settling in my chest, the same feeling I get 300 pages into an audit when I finally see the number that doesn't belong. The feeling of a discrepancy showing itself. My marriage, 11 years of it, a thing Daniel and I built with our own hands, had just been handed a price tag by a man who thought that was a generous thing to do. He genuinely believed he was being generous. That was the part one filed most carefully. He watched my face for a reaction. I gave him 4 seconds of nothing, maybe 5. Then he smiled, the way men like Marcus smile when silence makes them nervous, and he said the line I'd come to know very well. The line he delivered the way other men clear their throat. Everything has a price, Elena. You just haven't heard the right number yet. I understood several things at once. That he had contempt for me dressed up as desire. That he thought love was a line item you could buy out. That no one had ever once read his own contract back to him. And I understood that if I said no and walked out, I'd only ever have my word against his, and men like Marcus are very good at making a woman's word disappear. So I didn't say no. I picked up the envelope. I let him watch me pick it up. I told him it was a serious offer, and it deserved a serious answer, that I don't make decisions this size on emotion, that I'd consider it. But if he wanted me to consider it properly, I needed it the way I need everything. In writing. The terms, the timeline, the amount, all of it. Put your name to it, I said, and give me 30 days. He looked delighted. He thought he'd found my price. He thought the number had finally landed. He agreed to draft it. He shook my hand across the walnut like we'd closed a deal. I drove home that night with the envelope on the passenger seat, and I'll be clear about what I intended to do with the paperwork he was about to send me. I wasn't going to sign it. I was going to audit it. The written offer arrived 4 days later, by courier, in a folder embossed with the Harmon family crest, because of course it was. I read it twice fast for shape, then slowly, line by line, with a pen. The first thing I noticed wasn't the content. It was the structure. A man offering a woman money to leave her husband, if he were simply infatuated, would write something short and reckless. A number, a promise, a signature. Marcus had done the opposite. His document was careful. Lawyered. The $500,000 wasn't described as a gift or a bribe. It was consideration, and it was tied, in a clause I read 3 times, to a specific date. Not the date of my divorce, but a date roughly 30 days out. There was language about the dissolution of the current household, and about that dissolution being completed and documented by then. The money was contingent on timing in a way that had nothing to do with love. That was the first discrepancy. A man in a hurry to marry you does not care what month it happens. A man in a hurry to marry you by a specific Tuesday is not in a hurry about you. I set the document aside and did what I do for a living. I pulled the Harmon Holding Company's filings. People forget how much is public if you know where to look. The company was privately held, but it carried commercial debt, and commercial debt leaves a trail. Liens, filings, the paperwork lenders require that quietly enters the record. I spent 2 evenings at my kitchen table with a legal pad, reconciling the family I knew from the outside against the numbers I could see from the inside. They did not match. From the outside, Marcus was the picture of a man who had money. The cars. The watch he turned so you'd catch it. The house with the walnut table, the wine poured without asking. He performed wealth the way a company about to be sold performs health. Loudly, and only ever from across the room. The numbers said something else. Marcus, personally, wasn't liquid. The lifestyle was real, but it was borrowed against. His stake in the family company looked significant on paper, and paper isn't cash, and much of it appeared to be pledged, promised to lenders as collateral, which is what you do when you need money now and only have assets later. A man that leveraged does not have $500,000 in cash to hand a woman as a signing bonus. Not without it showing up somewhere. Not without it hurting. So, where was the money coming from? I went back to the document and read the consideration clause a 4th time, and this time I saw it the way I'd see it in an audit. The $500,000 wasn't structured as coming from Marcus at all. It was to be paid upon completion of the transaction contemplated herein, and the transaction contemplated wasn't our marriage. Marriage was mentioned almost as an afterthought, 1 line near the bottom. What the document actually revolved around was the dissolution of Daniel's household by that specific date. Let me say plainly what took me 2 evenings to be sure of, because I checked it the way I check everything, and I don't put a number on the page until it reconciles. Marcus did not want me. Marcus wanted something my divorce from Daniel would unlock, something worth far more than $500,000, and the $500,000 was just what he'd priced my cooperation at. A cost of acquisition, budgeted like any other line. The money wasn't really his to give. It was money he expected to have only after the thing my divorce triggered had already paid out. In the language of my trade, he was offering to pay me out of proceeds he didn't yet have, from a deal he hadn't yet closed, which depended entirely on me doing what he asked. I sat with that a long time. The house was quiet. Daniel was asleep upstairs, the man Marcus had called a mistake, the man who had no idea any of this was happening because I hadn't told him yet. I'll explain that choice later, because it was a choice. Here's what I knew and what I didn't. I knew the offer was a smokescreen for something structural, something in the bones of how the family fortune was held. I knew the deadline was real and it was 30 days. I knew the money moved wrong. What I didn't have was the document that would tell me exactly what my divorce was meant to unlock. The trust, the covenant, the clause, whatever turned Daniel's household is dissolved into money in Marcus's hands. That kind of document isn't public. It lives in a lawyer's file and a family safe. To see it, I needed someone on the inside. Someone the Harmons had spent years overlooking, the way they'd overlooked me. And I knew exactly who that was. Her name was Margaret, and she'd kept the Harmon family's books for 31 years. You've met a Margaret. Every wealthy family has one, the person who actually knows where everything is, who arrives before anyone and leaves after everyone, who gets thanked at Christmas with a card and a check that never quite reflects what she carries in her head. She'd started under the grandfather. She'd watched Marcus grow up. And in 3 decades of quiet dinners and quieter ledgers, she'd been introduced to guests, when she was introduced at all, as the woman who helps us with the numbers. I knew that sentence. I'd been introduced with one just like it. I'd only ever spoken to Margaret in passing, but I'd noticed her the way you notice competence. The way she watched the room, the small tightening around her eyes when Marcus performed. So I called her. I didn't dress it up. I told her Marcus had made me an offer, told her the shape of it, told her I didn't believe the money was what it pretended to be. Then I stopped talking and let the silence do the work. She was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "It took him longer than I thought to try something like this. We met at a coffee shop 2 towns over, the kind of place no Harmon would ever set foot in." She brought a folder. She said she'd promised the grandfather, years ago, that she'd keep the family's affairs in order, and that lately she'd come to understand that keeping them in order and keeping them quiet were no longer the same thing. She was retiring in the spring. She said it like a woman setting down something heavy she'd carried too long. I want to stop here, because this is the part one sat with the longest. If you've ever been the one who does the real work while someone louder takes the credit, if you've ever been introduced by your function instead of your name, valued for what you handle and never for who you are, watched a person with half your character handed the whole room because of who their father was, then you already know how Margaret and I found each other. You already know where this is going. That recognition, that quiet click of 2 overlooked people realizing they see the same thing, is the whole engine of a story like this one. If it's landing for you, stay with me and tell me in the comments about the person in your life who never saw your worth. I read them and I promise you're not the only one. Margaret slid the folder across the table. Gently, not the way Marcus slid things. And she said one thing before she let go of it. "He's not as rich as he needs everyone to think," she said. "He's been borrowing against tomorrow for years. And there's a clause in the trust your husband has never read that Daniel doesn't even know applies to him. That's what Marcus is really after. The rest, you, the money, all of it, that's just how he's trying to get there." I opened the folder that night, alone at my kitchen table. And there it was. The real reason. In plain language, on the 12th page, in a clause the grandfather had written decades before any of this, was the answer to why my divorce was worth a fortune to a man who claimed to want my hand. The clause was short, the way the costly ones usually are. The grandfather had built the holding company to pass to his sons in equal measure, but he'd been a careful man, and careful men worry about their money after they're gone. So he'd written in a condition. Control of the company, the voting shares that decided everything, worth on paper somewhere north of $40 million, was to split between his sons. But if either son's household were to dissolve before a certain generational date, that son's controlling interest would not pass to him outright. It would consolidate to the remaining brother. The grandfather meant it as a protection against divorce carving the company into pieces, against some future ex-spouse walking away with a slice of the family's control. He meant it kindly. He meant it to keep the thing whole. He hadn't imagined a son who'd read it as a map. I read it 4 times, and each time it got colder and clearer. Dissolution of the household. Not death. Not misconduct. Dissolution. A divorce. If Daniel and I divorced before that date, Daniel's half of the control didn't stay with Daniel. It went to Marcus. All of it. Marcus wouldn't own half the company anymore. He'd own the whole of its steering wheel. That was what he was buying. Sit with the arithmetic of it, because I did. Marcus had looked me in the eye and told me I was wasted, that I belonged with a man who could provide, that everything has a price, and I just hadn't heard the right number. He'd performed desire. He'd poured the wine and practiced the regretful face and made it sound like the most generous thing a man had ever offered a woman. And the whole time, I was never the asset. I was the mechanism. My marriage was a lock, my divorce was the key, and behind the door was control of a fortune worth tens of millions. The $500,000, the sum that was supposed to move me, The number he'd priced my whole life at wasn't even a real cost to him. Against 40 million in consolidated control, $500,000 is a rounding error. It's the fee you pay the locksmith. He hadn't offered me a fortune. He'd offered me the tip. I remember the exact moment it fully landed. Standing at my kitchen counter at 11 at night, folder open, coffee gone cold. What I felt wasn't heartbreak, though there was a version of me that could have been heartbroken. A woman told she was desired, discovering she was only ever a line in someone's acquisition budget. What I felt instead was the specific, professional stillness of an auditor who's finally found the transaction that explains all the others. Every strange clause in his offer reconciled now. The deadline. The consideration. The word dissolution doing quiet work near the bottom of the page. It balanced. The books were finally clean, and they told a filthy story. Here's the thing about knowing exactly what someone wants. It hands you the whole shape of the trap they've built, and a trap, once you can see its shape, is only ever as strong as the person who thinks you can't. Marcus needed me to sign. That was his single point of failure. The entire scheme, $40 million of it, depended on getting my name onto a divorce, willingly and quietly, by that date. He thought he was buying my cooperation. He was going to get it. I was going to say yes. I just wasn't going to say yes to his terms. I was going to say yes to mine. Let me stop here, because this is where most people would have made a mistake, and I want you to sit in the decision with me. The loud thing to do, the satisfying thing, the thing that feels like justice, would have been to take that folder straight to Daniel, then to their father, and to stand in that dining room and expose Marcus in front of the whole family. Let him be humiliated. Make him yell so everyone could see the man underneath the pressed shirt. I didn't do that. And I want to tell you why, because it's the whole lesson of everything I've learned in 20 years of reading other people's books. A man like Marcus can survive being accused. Accusations are noise, and he was very good at noise. He'd deny it, reframe it, make me the bitter wife who misunderstood a generous man, and by the end of the week the story would be about me. What a man like Marcus cannot survive is his own signature. You don't beat someone who lies for a living by shouting the truth. You beat him by handing him a pen. So I made a decision at that kitchen counter. I wasn't going to fight him. I didn't need to fight him. I needed him to sign one more time. Before I tell you what I put in front of him, I'm curious. Knowing what you know now, the clause, the deadline, the 40 million, what would you have done? Confront him or let him close the deal? Tell me in the comments. I mean it. I read them. Because what I did next started with a blank document and a very careful pen. I called Marcus the next morning and told him I'd decided. I said it the way you'd say yes to a business proposal you'd thought hard about. Measured, a little reluctant, the voice of a woman being practical about her future. I told him he'd been right. I told him I'd heard the number, and the number had moved me. I could hear him smile through the phone. Then I told him a woman doesn't dissolve an 11-year marriage on a handshake, and that if I was going to protect myself in this, I needed the agreement redrafted properly. My terms alongside his, my protections written in, everything clean. He'd priced my cooperation. Now I was going to act exactly like the mercenary he believed I was, and mercenaries want their contracts airtight. He found that reasonable. Of course he did. It confirmed everything he thought he knew about me. I said I'd have my own version drawn up. He said fine. He said, everything has a price, Elena. I told you. I let him have that. Then I sat down and did the most careful work of my career. I built the document to look like what he wanted. On the surface, it was a wife negotiating her exit. The 500,000, the timeline, the discretion, the quiet divorce by the date he needed. If Marcus skimmed it, and I was betting my whole life that he would, he'd see a woman protecting her payout and nothing more. Men like Marcus don't read the documents women hand them. They read the ones their lawyers hand them, and they sign the ones that come from someone they've already decided is beneath them. His arrogance wasn't a flaw I hoped for. It was a load-bearing assumption. I built the whole structure on it. But I write documents the way I read them. Every line doing work, nothing decorative, the important clauses buried exactly where a careless eye slides past. 3 of them mattered. The first restructured the 500,000. In his version, it was consideration. In mine, it was consideration too, but I defined it. I wrote, in plain terms, what the money was consideration for. For my agreement to dissolve my marriage in order to, and I quoted his document's own language, effect the transaction contemplated herein. I made the paper say out loud what his had only implied. On its face it read like precision a nervous woman would want. What it actually did was turn the money into a documented admission that the payment, the divorce, and the transaction were one connected act. I was making him put his purpose in writing in his own signed hand. The second clause was the admission itself, dressed as a recital. Contracts open with recitals, the whereas section, the part everyone schemes because it's throat-clearing before the real terms. I wrote ours to state the background of the agreement. Whereas Party A has offered Party B the sum in exchange for the dissolution of Party B's household. Whereas this dissolution is understood by both parties to affect the disposition of interests under the family trust dated such and such. Nobody reads recitals. But recitals are still signed. And a signed recital is a man agreeing, in writing, that these are the true facts of what he's doing. The third clause was the quiet one, and it was the whole trap. I tied the agreement's validity to the trust. I wrote that the entire arrangement was contingent upon, and subject to, the terms and good faith operation of the family trust, that if any provision of the trust were triggered improperly or induced in bad faith, the agreement and its obligations would be subject to review by the trustee. To Marcus, if he noticed it at all, it would look like boilerplate. A cautious woman covering herself. What it actually did was hand the trustee a signed thread to pull, one that led straight back to a document proving Marcus had engineered the trigger on purpose. Every line carried weight. None of it looked like it did. I had it couriered to him in a folder without a crest. He signed it 4 days later. I know he signed it in under 10 minutes because Margaret was in the house that afternoon and she told me he barely sat down. He skimmed it, the way I knew he would, and he put his name to every page. The trap was built. The trap was signed. It just wasn't sprung yet. Because none of it would mature until the date on the page, 30 days out, at the one gathering where the whole family and the trustee would be in the same room. That gathering was the grandfather's memorial dinner, held every autumn, the one night of the year the whole family sat at the walnut table together. The father at the head, Marcus to his right, Daniel and me down toward the end, where we always were. And this year, seated quietly near the father, a man in a gray suit I'd made sure would be there. The trustee, the independent lawyer the grandfather had named to administer the family trust. I'd written to him a week earlier. I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I'd simply said I had documents relevant to the trust's operation and that I believed he'd want to see them in the presence of the family. A trustee has a duty. He came. Dinner was ordinary for a while. Marcus was expansive that night, the way a man is when he thinks he's about to win. The divorce paperwork was moving. The date was days away. He caught my eye once across the table and gave me the smallest nod, the nod of a man confirming a transaction. I gave him nothing back. I was waiting. I'd waited 30 days. I could wait through the entrees. When the plates were cleared, I asked if I could say something to the family. That was unusual on its own, since I never spoke at these dinners, and the table went quiet the way a room does when it senses weather coming. I didn't raise my voice. Remember that, because it's the whole point. I never once raised my voice. I said Marcus had made me an offer, and that I thought the family should understand its terms. I took out the first folder, set it on the table, and slid it, gently, down the walnut to the trustee. Not to the father. To the trustee. I'd thought carefully about the order of it. The trustee had to be the one holding the paper when the father read it, so that it was already, in that moment, a matter of the trust and not a family quarrel that could be smoothed over by morning. Inside was the signed agreement. Marcus's version and mine, both bearing his signature. I explained, plainly, what the document said. That Marcus had offered me $500,000 to divorce Daniel. That the payment was defined, in his own signed hand, as consideration for dissolving my household in order to effect a transaction under the family trust. That the recitals he'd signed stated, as agreed fact, that this dissolution was understood by both parties to affect the disposition of interests under the trust. I watched the trustee read. I watched him reach page 12 of the trust in his own memory and connect it to the page in front of him. I watched his face do the thing a professional's face does when the numbers reconcile into something ugly. Then I set down the second thing. A small recorder. Because on the afternoon Marcus first slid an envelope across this table, I'd been recording. I live in a place where the law lets you record a conversation you're part of, and I'm a woman who documents. It had been in my bag, running, the whole time. I didn't play all of it. I played 19 seconds. 19 seconds of Marcus's voice, unmistakable, filling that silent dining room. Everything has a price, Elena. You just haven't heard the right number yet. The room didn't erupt. That's not how these things actually go. It went very, very quiet. The father set down his glass. Daniel, beside me, had gone completely still. I'll come back to Daniel, because what he did mattered. But in that moment, I kept my eyes on Marcus, and I watched a man discover that paper is not the same as power. Here's what Marcus never understood. He thought a signed document was a weapon because he had money and lawyers, and had always been able to point his signature at people and make them do things. But a signature only protects you if you know what you signed. Marcus had spent his whole life having documents handed to him by people beneath him, skimming them, signing them, trusting that his position made the fine print irrelevant. He signed mine in under 10 minutes. And every clause I'd buried was doing exactly what I'd built it to do. The trust clause he'd tried to weaponize, the one that would have handed him Daniel's control if my household dissolved, required, like every trust provision, good faith. You cannot manufacture the trigger. You cannot pay someone to dissolve a household specifically to consolidate control and then claim the trigger fired innocently. That's called bad faith inducement, and it doesn't just fail to give you what you wanted. It exposes the whole scheme to the trustee's review. Marcus's own signed agreement was the proof of the bad faith. He hadn't just failed to spring his trap. He'd handed the trustee, in writing, the confession that unwound it. The clause he built to take everything now pointed the other way. His signature was the smoking gun. Not mine. His. I folded my hands on the walnut. I'd said everything I came to say, and I'd said it at a level tone. Then I looked at the trustee and asked the only question left. Given what's in front of you, I said, what happens now? His answer was short. He said that on the evidence in front of him, he had a duty to suspend any consolidation of control under the trust pending a full review, and that a signed agreement to induce a dissolution for the purpose of triggering that clause was, on its face, exactly the kind of bad faith the grandfather's provision existed to prevent. In plain terms, the door Marcus had spent 30 days trying to unlock was now bolted, and he was the one who'd handed over the proof. Nothing consolidated to him. Nothing moved. The control he'd tried to steal stayed exactly where it was, and his standing to ever try again was gone. The father didn't yell either. That surprised me. He just looked at his older son for a long moment, and I watched a lifetime of preference drain out of the old man's face. He'd spent decades seeing Marcus as the capable one, the one who understood money and legacy and how the world worked. Now he was looking at a man who'd tried to buy his brother's wife to pick his own family's pocket and been undone by his own signature at the dinner table. Some things you can't unsee once you see them plainly. He saw Marcus plainly. That cost Marcus more than the trust ever could. And Daniel. Daniel took my hand under the table, and when I finally looked at him, I understood he wasn't wounded, not the way I'd feared. I hadn't told him beforehand, and I'd worried he might feel handled or humiliated to learn his marriage had been shopped for like a parcel of land. But what he saw was a wife who'd found the knife at his back and removed it without once making him the smaller man in the room. I hadn't exposed him. I'd protected him. Quietly. He knew the difference. You already know the rest, because you saw it at the start. 30 days after Marcus slid an envelope across that walnut table, he sat back down at it and asked me to undo it. Same table. Same man. Hands that wouldn't stop moving. He'd found me alone after the review began, when he finally understood how finished it was, and he'd come to buy his way back out the only way he knew how. Undo it, he said. Whatever you did. Name it. Everything has a price. I let it sit. For seconds. Maybe 5. Then I gave him the only mercy I had, because I'm not a cruel woman and cruelty would have cost me something I wanted to keep. I told him I wasn't going to pursue anything beyond what the trustee already had. I wasn't going to the family with more than I'd shown, wasn't going to the papers, wasn't going to make his ruin louder than it needed to be. He could keep his name. He could keep his half. What he couldn't keep was the thing he'd reached for, and he couldn't keep the belief that people like me could be bought. You were right, I told him. Everything has a price. You just never read what you were signing. That was the last real conversation Marcus and I ever had. There was one thing left to decide, and it was mine alone. What I'd keep from all of this, and what I'd quietly walk away from. What I walked away from was the $500,000. I never took a cent of it. The agreement collapsed with everything else, and I was glad to let it go. Money like that comes with a price of its own, and I'd read the fine print on it long ago. What I kept was simpler. I kept my marriage. 11 years, and now 12, and Daniel still teaches history to children who have no idea their teacher's wife once reconciled a $40 million fortune at a dinner table without raising her voice. I kept my name, the one his family never bothered to use. And I kept the quiet, which I've come to understand is the most valuable thing I own. People like Marcus believe everything has a price. They believe it so completely that they never think to check whether it's true. But some things don't reconcile to a number. A marriage isn't a line item. Loyalty isn't consideration. And a woman who reads contracts for a living is not an asset you can acquire. She's the one auditing the deal. Everything has a price, he told me. He was almost right. He just never understood that the price of trying to buy me was everything he already had. If someone in your life ever tried to put a number on you, tried to buy your silence, your loyalty, your absence, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments. I read every one. I'll see you in the next story.